Today, I have the pleasure of introducing Bianca Silva Santos, Dissertation Defense. The title of the dissertation is Adaptive Management of Marine Biodiversity at the Science Policy Society, Nexus. I'm Fiorenza Micheli. I'm a professor in the Ocean Department and chair of the department, and I will be chair of the Dissertation Defense Committee. I also want to introduce Bianca's lead advisors, Professor Gabriele Won-Parodi and Professor Larry Crowder. They will introduce Bianca in a second. Sorry, I'm going to scroll down so that I can read all of their titles. There are many titles. Larry is the Edward Ricketts Probostia Professor, also Professor of Oceans, Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment, and Professor of Biology by courtesy. Gabriele is Assistant Professor of Earth System Science, Center Fellows at the Woods Institute for the Environment, and Assistant Professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability. And then we're also joined by two other committee members, which are Jim Lee, co-director of Center for Ocean Solutions, and Senior Fellow at Woods Institute for the Environment. I don't need to read those titles. And Professor in Oceans by courtesy, and Sibyl Diver, lecturer in Earth System Program and co-lead for the Stanford Environmental Justice Working Group. So Bianca will present her dissertation work. This will be about 45 minutes. We'll have 10 minutes for Q&A. If you're here in the room, please raise your hand, and I pass the mic for the questions. And for those on Zoom, please type your questions in the Q&A box, and we will read them aloud for Bianca to address. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the podium to Gabriele for introductions. Thank you.
Thank you, Fio. Oh, Bianca. So I know you have an amazing presentation today, so I'm just going to say a few words. It was 2019 when I was standing in my office at Lawrence Berkeley Lab, cleaning it out, preparing to move to Stanford, when I had a phone call with Larry. And he was very excited. He was like, I have to tell you about Bianca. And I'm like, well, who's Bianca, first of all, and what is this about? And he's like, Bianca is a prospective E-IPER student, and she is one of the once-in-a-lifetime students that I think we should try to get. So I really, really want you to meet with her when she comes to E-IPER to do an interview. And so as soon as I got to Stanford, I looked at her file, and it was impressive. And then it was even more impressive when I had the opportunity to meet with you. And I said, oh my goodness, this is what it's all about. I would love to work with you and to work with you and Larry and to do some really incredible work, which you've done. And I think, you know, we all know working with you, you ask the right questions. You are a big thinker, which is amazing. And you also are able to adeptly and with grace pivot when needed, as you had to do during the COVID pandemic. And I think we're going to see this here, the amazing amount of work you've been able to do, the creativity, the originality of your thinking is going to be on display, and the multiple methods and approaches that you've used. It's really, really impressive. And I have felt over the past 5 years honored and humbled to be working with you. And I know that you are moving on to bigger and better things and forging your own path. And I can only hope that our paths will continue to intersect and cross in coming years. So thank you, Bianca.
So yeah, those of you who know me as a faculty mentor, I'm a talent scout. And I worked with something like 50 PhD students, and I'm shameless about promoting extraordinary people, even like lobbying the E-IPER staff to look carefully at candidates. I need to tell a little bit deeper story with Bianca. I met her at a sea turtle conference in Croatia, at which I was invited to be the keynote speaker by a guy that I was a mentor for who was running the meeting. And Bianca gave a talk the opening morning, I think before my talk. And I was just blown away, and I thought, that's an amazing piece of PhD research, and I rushed up to her right afterwards to see if she wanted a postdoc. And she said, that was just my master's work. And I was no less impressed that it was just her master's work. But when I began talking to her about, so you have a master's, are you interested in doing a PhD? The first thing she told me is absolutely not. I have no interest in doing a PhD, which kind of set me back a little bit because I think of myself as a pretty good salesman. But she didn't know about E-IPER. She thought of a PhD as the traditional disciplinary deep into oceanography, and not that there wasn't a program that allowed her to work across the range that she'll talk about today. We left that meeting. I think she applied to E-IPER just to shut me up. Like, he's not going to leave me alone if I don't apply, but I won't get in. I won't get an interview, so it's not a problem. Then she was here interviewing, and I think she was beginning to get a little bit more concerned. Then she got an offer, and she had to decide whether this was something she wanted to do with 5 years of her life. It's been a real pleasure for us to work with you, Bianca, and what you will see today is the kind of thing that you can, that somebody like Bianca can do with the opportunity that E-IPER offers. And so many students really take advantage of this opportunity because this program, although it's 22, 23 years old now, is still right on the edge, providing opportunities for students to do things that are unique by traditional academic standards. So it's a real pleasure to hear you today. Just before I finish, I'll tell you, she's moving on to another job, but we're working on a contract to keep her working on one of my research projects part-time for the next 2 years. So I kind of never let my students go. It's family. So thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank you both for your words. That was really great, really sweet. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate everybody being here today. I'm excited to be sharing 5 years of research here at Stanford, focused on the management of marine biodiversity. Marine biodiversity serves as the building blocks of a functioning ocean ecosystem. The ocean and life within it provides 50% of oxygen on Earth, provides a significant source of protein for over 3 billion people worldwide, and drives a rapidly growing ocean-based economy valued at $3 to $6 trillion. While a healthy marine ecosystem affects all of us, multiple threats, such as overfishing, habitat destruction, and pollution, critically jeopardize the sustainability of these systems. As a result, marine biodiversity has declined at alarming rates. Populations have decreased nearly 50% since the 1970s. Notably, stressors on marine life are only expected to intensify, given the escalating threat of climate change. Such impacts can irreversibly transform marine ecosystems and create enormous challenges for coastal communities worldwide. As a complex social ecological system, the management of marine biodiversity will require an interdisciplinary approach at the intersection of science, policy, and society. First, a deeper understanding of species movement ecology is necessary for effectively protecting species throughout their entire range. Second, the widespread habitat use of marine animals can create challenges for stakeholders, particularly given our physically borderless, yet legally bounded ocean. Finally, careful consideration of the human dimensions of ocean management is vital for supporting the well-being of coastal communities and achieving sustainable outcomes that benefit nature and people alike. Together, this is where my PhD research comes in, which is focused on the management of marine biodiversity from across the science, policy, society dimensions. Notably, when I use the word adaptive management, I'm referring specifically to management under future governance and environmental conditions, namely climate change, as well as management across a range of stakeholders, from international policymakers to individual fishers. For example, what is the future of ocean management, given new international legal frameworks? Or how will the impacts of climate change on marine biodiversity affect individual fishers? I explore these types of questions over a series of 5 dissertation chapters, which span across these dimensions in various ways. Notably, this body of work can also be thought of as management considerations from the global to local scale. My first 3 chapters are focused on the global level. I use methods such as expert synthesis, as well as policy and spatial analyses to consider management gaps and opportunities for migratory marine species. Then, my last 2 chapters zoom in to assess the social, ecological, and equity considerations that climate change may pose on small-scale fishers, focusing in on Palau. And in these chapters, I use survey data and oceanographic models. Together, this body of work will highlight how the adaptive management of marine biodiversity will really require an interdisciplinary approach that thoughtfully incorporates research tools and methods across these different levels. So let's dive right in, pun intended, starting at the global level. The ocean covers about 70% of the Earth's surface, the vast of which remains unexplored and is home to millions of species. While ocean exploration and fishing go back centuries, technological advances throughout the 20th century really revolutionized oceanographic development. As a result, resources began to become exploited in new and often unsustainable ways. Increasing ocean use highlighted a clear need for a more comprehensive set of rules for how to govern the ocean. In 1982, the international community came together to adopt a set of guidelines known as the Law of the Sea to resolve several key issues around ocean use and sovereignty. The treaty gave coastal nations full rights to manage and exploit resources within 200 nautical miles from their coast, known as the EEZ, but it left more than 60% of the ocean surface in areas beyond national jurisdictions, where all countries had the freedom to use the ocean and its resources as they seem fit. While there are global organizations and agreements for managing activities in these spaces, a few shown here on the screen, they tend to focus on specific regions or activities. And this has led to a fragmented management system in areas beyond national jurisdictions, which are largely ineffective in protecting biodiversity. For example, while marine protected areas do exist, as shown here on the map, the vast majority are located within these EEZs. Meanwhile, less than 1% of areas beyond national jurisdictions are fully or highly protected. It has now been over 40 years since the Law of the Sea. Here, we can see a more modern extent of human activity. The lights represent fishing vessels and show how the human footprint has really grown into the open ocean. Such changes in ocean use today, particularly in areas beyond national jurisdiction, have highlighted significant governance gaps that the original treaty was not designed to address. In the early 2000s, the international community came together to discuss a new framework for managing marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdiction, known as the BB&J Treaty. A series of informal discussions and working groups led to multiple rounds of negotiations. However, consensus was not reached. Several key countries were concerned about the treaty's legal and economic implications and pushed for a less ambitious approach. Recognizing a need to mobilize international support, myself and a group of colleagues and experts from several institutions came together to write a perspective piece to encourage countries to adopt the treaty. Up until this point, much of the discussion on the treaty really focused on the ecological or environmental benefits of conserving biodiversity. We wanted to broaden this conversation and wrote a paper highlighting the other types of benefits a treaty could provide. This became the focus of Chapter 1. We synthesized our collective knowledge and expertise to identify 3 different types of benefits the treaty could offer, including those that are diplomatic, economic, and social in nature. Let's start with the diplomatic benefits. First, we found that the BB&J Treaty could strengthen international cooperation and governance. It could address many of the challenges and inefficiencies that are present in the current regional and sectoral-based governance system, and instead create a platform for more integrated management. Additionally, the treaty can help advance climate resilience. Despite pledges by nations worldwide to combat climate change, current levels of ambition are not on track to meet global goals. Notably, the ocean is the world's largest carbon sink on the planet and plays a key role in mitigating climate change. Protecting marine ecosystems through the treaty can help make the ocean more resilient to climate change and thus strengthen international diplomacy. Next, the ocean supports a wide range of renewable economic activities, generating millions of jobs and revenue. Stronger biodiversity protections can improve ecosystem health and economically boost ocean-related industries. Further, the ocean is a vastly interconnected system. Protecting biodiversity in international waters can benefit coastal economies by improving the health and availability of fish that move into more domestic areas. Finally, a strong and well-designed BB&J agreement could also promote global equity, which is the goal of the UN and many member states. The treaty could include funding mechanisms for capacity building in developing countries, support data systems that integrate both traditional and local knowledge, as well as protect the rights of all people to be meaningfully involved in decision-making. These are just a few of the main points that we discussed in this chapter, which was published back in 2022 in Frontiers in Marine Science. We argue that stronger biodiversity conservation would also be consistent with the diplomatic, economic, and social interests of member states. Further, the new treaty could serve as a model for how you can combat global challenges with internationally coordinated action, with a diverse suite of benefits that are applicable to other contexts. To maximize impact, this paper was strategically published in August 2022 during the 5th round of treaty negotiations, and a one-pager was actually made available to delegates during the meeting. Further, our paper was later promoted by the IUCN as a resource for delegates during subsequent negotiations on their website and social media. Notably, the BB&J Treaty was successfully passed last June. However, there's still a ways to go in terms of gathering the international support to ratify and fully implement it. Until then, it's important to consider what is the current governance in place protecting these species. I consider this in Chapter 2, where I assess the management measures protecting highly migratory marine species in the Pacific. This map shows tagging data, represented by the different colored dots, of different migratory species in the Pacific. These animals have complex movements that take them through both the EEZs of multiple countries, as well as areas beyond national jurisdiction. As a result, these species are exposed to many different management and policy frameworks as they migrate through various waters. Notably, it can be really hard to compare regulations across countries due to different languages and administrative systems. Given these challenges, most scientific studies that assess biodiversity policies tend to focus on specific species or specific countries. But developing an approach to compare policies across these different dimensions is really key for more holistic understanding of policy gaps and opportunities throughout their entire range. This is where Chapter 2 comes in. Together with co-authors, I sought to develop a method for identifying and classifying management strategies across multiple dimensions. I applied this exercise specifically to bycatch in the Northeast Pacific. And bycatch is when marine animals get accidentally captured or entangled in fishing gear and remains a top threat for many migratory species globally. I consider management regulations across 3 different dimensions, including 3 focal species that are commonly caught as bycatch. This includes shooty shearwaters, loggerhead sea turtles, and shortfin mako sharks. I focused on policies related to 4 different types of fishing gears, including long lines, gill nets, trawls, and purse seines, which pose a bycatch threat to at least one of the study species. And finally, I look at management regulations implemented across 8 jurisdictional areas. This included 5 areas under national jurisdictions, so the EEZs of Canada, the US, and Mexico. And notably, I broke down the US to look at policies in Alaska, the lower 48, and Hawaii separately. And then I also looked at management regulations by 3 regional fishery management organizations that operate in the study area. Together, this chapter takes a cross-species, cross-gear, and cross-jurisdiction approach to better understand the policy landscape in this region. For methods, I develop a 3-step process for selecting, searching, and classifying policies to overcome many of the challenges in trying to compare and collate regulations across space. And I'll walk through each of them separately. First, to identify potentially relevant documents, I relied on a desk-based search of existing laws, policies, and regulations related to bycatch across the areas of interest. I predominantly used FAOLEX, which is a legislative and policy online database compiled by the UN. Notably, it is significantly underutilized in the scientific literature. Only 2 results were found in a Web of Science search, and instead, it's mostly used in legal scholarship. I used the database to search for policies related to bycatch and filter them to just the areas of interest. I then supplemented the FAOLEX search with a few other websites and resources in order to ensure a more complete set of documents. This resulted in over 1,200 policies that could be potentially relevant to study objectives. The next challenge was, how do you effectively search through over 1,200 policies and subset those for further review? To do this, I imported all of our documents into NVivo, which is a qualitative data analysis software, and used its advanced keyword search to sub-select just those bycatch policies related to the right combination of species, gear, and area that I was interested in. The last step was then organizing these policies. I created a system for classifying them using the mitigation hierarchy, which is a broad conservation framework for managing the impacts of biodiversity. It was originally developed for terrestrial systems, but has recently been applied to marine systems, and specifically to managing the impacts of bycatch. Here are two examples of that framework used in other studies. You can see some of the broad categories are the same, but there are also some different ones. Further, the specific management actions within each of the frameworks also tend to differ based on what's most appropriate in the study context. Informed by this framework, I created my own bycatch mitigation hierarchy with 8 indicators across 4 main categories, chosen based on a literature review of the relevant bycatch approaches for my study species and context. So once I had my framework, I then manually reviewed the sub-selected policies and classified them based on these categories. In summary, I found that most policies in our case study really focused on remediating or researching bycatch rather than avoiding or minimizing its impacts, which align really well with prior work. While this chapter offers a broad review of bycatch management in this case study, its key contribution actually lies in the methodological approach for identifying, collating, and comparing bycatch policies across multiple dimensions. Notably, I had the opportunity to travel to Tromsø, Norway, to present this work at a workshop at the Norwegian Center for the Law of the Sea. Although I didn't know when I applied, I actually ended up being the only scientist among like 25 lawyers and legal scholars. And they were very familiar with FAOLEX, but they didn't know the science side of things. So again, just kind of highlighted the need for people and research approaches that really bridge these disciplinary silos. Future work could use my approach and framework to expand on this in other contexts. They could validate the policy searches with interviews with stakeholders, as well as consider the effectiveness of these approaches in practice. This chapter is still in prep, but we hope that it provides a useful starting point to motivate policy-focused research in other contexts. Now, these policies are helping to manage species based on their habitat use today. But species movements and home ranges are changing as ocean temperatures rise. Our climate system is facing unprecedented changes. Average sea surface temperatures have steadily increased since the 1970s. As a result, species movements are also changing, with many species moving deeper or expanding poleward to stay within preferred environmental conditions. Tagging data has really improved our understanding of species movements, represented here by the moving black line. It also allowed us to better understand the underlying environmental conditions that drive species habitat use. Using oceanographic models, we can combine this information to identify areas of potential suitable habitat for specific species. Notably, tagging data is real-time data, so it only tells us what is happening today. But to inform adaptive management, we really want to know what habitat use may be like in the future. To do that, we don't have tagging data. Instead, we can use what we know about suitable species habitat use today, combine that with projections and data of environmental conditions in the future, to get projections of suitable habitat for specific species in the future. Hazen et al. 2012 considers this more deeply in a paper assessing the predicted habitat shifts of Pacific predators in a changing climate. This data set became the foundation of my third chapter. In the study, they combine raw tagging data with underlying environmental conditions for specific species to create maps characterizing areas of suitable habitat. Here, the reds represent areas where more habitat is likely based on environmental preferences, while the blues represent areas that are less likely. They then used climate projections to assess how projected suitable habitat may change in the future under climate change. They did this for several species and were ultimately able to quantify which species may gain habitat, shown in the blue bars, and which may lose habitat, shown in the red, by the end of the century. Now, this analysis is really focused on magnitude, or total size of habitat change, but an important consideration is the spatial component of these change, particularly as they relate to jurisdictional boundaries. This became the focus of Chapter 3. Along with my suite of co-authors, we used the Hazen et al. Dataset to consider how the proportion of suitable habitat within various jurisdictions may shift under climate change, and ultimately highlight emerging governance challenges this may pose. I focus in on 4 species from the Hazen paper, including a seabird and shark at both extreme ends of the winners or losers climate scenario, as well as 2 more moderate cases, which includes a northern elephant seal and California sea lion. I assessed habitat changes across 4 jurisdictions, including Canada, the US, Mexico, as well as areas beyond national jurisdiction. And finally, I look at about 100 years worth of data, including species habitat projections throughout the 21st century. So in this chapter, I take the model outputs from the Hazen et al. Paper and to subset just the top quantile of data, so the top 25%, in order to reduce uncertainty and identify quote-unquote core habitat, so areas where suitable habitat is most likely. I recoded that data to just consider presence or absence of core habitat and overlay it with jurisdictional boundaries. I then calculated the proportion of core habitat within each of these jurisdictions. For example, we can see that about 60% of core habitat is projected to be within areas beyond national jurisdictions, with much smaller percents in the other areas. I do the same calculation using model outputs throughout the end of the century and plot the results. So here, the y-axis represents percent deviation from average conditions during the first decade, given that I was interested in how conditions may change relative to the beginning of the century. And the x represent model year. The lines are the results, which show how the proportion of core habitat within each jurisdiction may change relative to that of the first decade. For example, for shooty shearwaters, we found that projected core habitat may increase in the US EEZ, but decrease in areas beyond national jurisdiction. I performed the same analyses for 4 species, and overall found that study species may experience a 2.5 to 10% change in habitat shifts across various jurisdictions. These changes will introduce new governance challenges. First, collaborative management approaches that transcend borders will be key to allow for flexible approaches as species needs shifts. Marine protected areas can help with species conservation, but they must be collaboratively designed across countries using climate-smart principles, such as through the use of adaptive and dynamic conservation tools, as well as building climate change into management objectives. Further, areas beyond national jurisdiction will continue to be an important habitat for these animals. Expanding biodiversity protections in these spaces, such as through the BB&J Treaty, will be vital. Finally, planning ahead for climate-ready management will also require investing in tracking data and monitoring of both species and human movements at sea to anticipate potential overlaps and identify priority areas for conservation. This chapter was just published earlier this spring in NPJ Ocean Sustainability. Notably, given limitations with the underlying data set, the chapter really aims to provide an analytical approach that can be used to think about these types of questions using updated and newer models. Understanding where climate-driven shifts may occur in relation to jurisdictions can inform where proactive and climate-smart management measures may be needed. Future work building upon this research will require updated projections of both human and species movements, as well as should consider risk exposure and vulnerability at more fine-scale levels. So that was a broad overview of my first 3 chapters, which focused more on the global scale. Now we're going to shift and talk a little bit more about management considerations at the local level. So Pacific Island countries and territories are at the forefront of the climate crisis. This region is experiencing the brunt of climate-related impacts, such as rising sea levels, warming oceans, and extreme weather events. My research focuses in on the Republic of Palau, a large ocean state where more than 70% of households rely on marine resources for economic and social livelihoods. Coastal fisheries are dominated by small-scale fisheries, which have an estimated worth of over $3 million. They provide a significant source of food, income, and cultural identity. There are three main groups of seafood that small-scale fishers target in Palau. This includes offshore fish that use open water pelagic habitats, such as tunas and marlins, demersal reef fish, which remain within shallow water reefs, such as parrotfish and groupers, and invertebrates, including clams and sea cucumbers. Notably, marine resource harvest is also partitioned by gender. So men typically target higher value finfish in offshore waters or coastal reefs, while women tend to be the customary stewards of invertebrates. Notably, all of these resources are expected to be impacted by climate change, which can significantly impact the lives of the people who rely on them. Importantly, holistic management will require consideration of both the social and ecological impacts of climate change. I investigate this more deeply in the context of Palau in Chapter 4. This research was conducted in collaboration with community partners at the Abeille Society, which is a local environmental nonprofit. And I spent a month in Palau working with Abeille in October of 2022, collecting data for this research. This chapter also pulls on the collective guidance, knowledge, and expertise of over a dozen co-authors. In this chapter, I consider social ecological impacts across 5 key dimensions. First, let's start with the ecological impacts, which were assessed using oceanographic models. I used species distribution models to predict how climate change may affect the distribution of 66 ecologically and culturally important species. I used a multi-model ensemble weighting the average across 7 models, where habitat suitability is predicted based on temperature, salinity, and bathymetry. I compare early to mid-century conditions using a high-emission climate scenario. And finally, I used very novel and high-resolution climate data, applying it to the local context for the first time. Here are the results for oceanic fish, which is averaging across 9 species. Similar to my previous chapters, I'm assessing changes in habitat suitability, or HSI, based on environmental preferences. So these colors represent changes in HSI by mid-century. And overall, the results indicate that some of Palau's waters may become less suitable for oceanic fish, shown in the red, while others may become more suitable, as shown in the blue. Here are the results for one other group of species, reef fish, averaging across 24 species. We're focused in on the coral reef around Palau's largest island of Babeladaub, and we use the same methods as before to calculate changes in habitat suitability. This map shows a lot more red, suggesting that reef fish may have much less suitable habitat by mid-century due to climate change. Importantly, reef fish tend to have much smaller home ranges and be more limited in mobility, so they may actually face local extinction if their habitats were to decline. These are just examples from 2 groups, but in total, I look at over 66 species aggregated into 7 groups by habitat use and species type. I found that overall, pelagic fish on average may actually face a modest increase in habitat suitability, while reef fish and invertebrates are projected to decline. Notably, if suitable habitats decline, there could be fewer marine resources, affecting the fishers who depend on them. These changes can also raise equity concerns, given that the spaces that women most frequently rely on include the habitats and spaces that are most at risk. Now let's shift to the social impacts of climate change. I explored fisher perceptions, behaviors, and adaptive capacity across 4 question themes by combining data from 3 different survey efforts. The first was a 2022 survey where I designed the questions, went to Palau to help collect the data, and analyze the results. And I supplemented this with unpublished data from 2 other surveys. One of the question themes I explored was how fisher perceptions around climate change. I found that many fishers are actually aware of climate change. They see it as a threat that's already harming their marine resources today, as well as one that is expected to continue to negatively impact resources in the future. I then presented fishers with hypothetical scenarios to assess how they might respond if they had a major 50% decline in catch. Most fishers said that they would adopt their behavior in some way in order to be able to continue fishing. But this raises the question of what would they change? If resources decline today, almost half report that they would change their fishing location, which is a common response found in other areas. However, this could pose significant financial and logistical burdens. If resources were to decline in the future, responses were much more varied and included actions such as targeting new species or fishing more often. These are just a few results of this chapter, which was recently submitted. It shows that mixed methods approaches, which consider both the social and ecological dimensions of climate change, are vital for more holistic understanding and management of these systems. Notably, climate change won't affect all species and fishers the same. Local conditions should be carefully considered to ensure strategies are equitable and culturally minded. These results provide a starting point to inform future research and management efforts in Palau. It also provides a framework of important social ecological considerations that can be studied in other contexts. My last chapter focuses in on the gender and equity dimensions of fisheries management. Notably, the impacts of climate change are not equally felt by all. Women make up 40% of small-scale fishers worldwide, yet their contributions are often overlooked and undervalued. Importantly, gender intersects with other social identities, such as race, class, age, and marital status, to impact one's perspectives, experiences, and behaviors. Intersectional research approaches, which considers how gender intersects with other social identities, can be used to inform the design of more equitable management. In Palau, men and women have distinct yet equally important ecological knowledge, from generations of adapting to environmental changes. While women hold traditional positions of power and respect, centuries of colonization has weakened women's power and privileged men's ecological knowledge. Today, women remain underrepresented in leadership positions. In addition to gender, marital status was identified through study co-design with local partners as a locally relevant demographic variable that can influence one's responsibilities and access to natural resources. In Palau, family relationships are very important, both socially and economically. Land is usually managed through traditional systems and inherited through family lineages. Upon marriage, women typically relocate to live with their husband and his family. Thus, marital status, particularly for women, can influence one's land-based rights and access to natural resources. Marriage has also been found to significantly increase motorboat access for Palauan women, but not for men, which can help women increase mobility, reach different harvesting sites, and even gather resources in greater volume. Finally, women in many Pacific Island countries and around the globe are commonly viewed as the primary caretaker of their homes and families. So marriage can introduce new responsibilities, new cultural obligations, and limit women's participation in the workforce. While some studies have begun to look at how both gender and marital status independently affect small-scale fishers, rarely do they explore how these two factors intersect with one another. In Chapter 5, my co-authors and I consider how gender intersect with marital status to impact fisher perceptions and potential adaptations to climate change in the Palauan context. I used survey data collected on behalf of the Palauan government for a 2020 national report. A random sampling approach was used where local researchers knocked on every other door in study communities, serving as many people at home who were willing and able. In total, over 479 participants identified either fishing or collecting invertebrates as research categories that they were particularly knowledgeable about, so that data was subset for analysis in this study. I assessed 4 question themes around perceptions and behavioral intentions. I analyzed responses by gender and marital status separately, as well as considered intersectionality between them. Specifically, I compared responses between married versus unmarried women and married versus unmarried men. Here I will just highlight 2 results. First, to assess perceptions around threats to marine resources, a check all that apply question was asked, asking fishers to select from a list the types of hazards that they thought were threatening marine resources. I then counted up the number of different threats that were chosen and created a count score. Here are those results by gender, with the number in the middle of the pie charts indicating the average number of threats selected by each group. As we can see, on average, women perceive that marine resources are threatened by a significantly greater number of environmental hazards compared to men. Notably, gender and marital status was also significant for women. Unmarried women were more aware of more threats to marine resources than married women. The same differences were not seen among men. These results may be related to gender divisions in marine resources and responsibilities. Women have reported their fishing grounds as being impacted by activities such as dredging and development, and some women fishing areas have already been completely lost due to pollution and land reclamation. As a result, women may be more aware of hazards to marine resources than men due to gendered impacts on the habitats they rely on. Further, married women have the food and financial security of their spouse for social and cultural obligations. They instead may take on new responsibilities and lose their connection to fishing grounds. On the other hand, unmarried women provide food and earn an income on their own. They may rely more on marine resources and therefore be more aware of their threats. This may also mean that they are more vulnerable to the resource loss. Similar to the data presented in Chapter 4, I analyzed the question about what fishers would do if their resources were to decline. Unmarried women were significantly more likely than married women to report an intention to keep fishing the same amount and not do anything differently. This may be due to differential responsibilities due to marital status. If marine resources decrease, married women may be more secure, given that they can pool resources with their spouse. They may decrease their harvesting and take on other responsibilities, or try and look for other sources of food and livelihood. On the other hand, unmarried women may not have as much flexibility, given that they do not have the same type of spousal support. Research shows that unmarried women often have less access to resources and assistance during hardships. Together, these results highlight the importance of intersectionality as an analytical framework. We found clear, nuanced relationships between gender and marital status among small-scale fishers in Palau, particularly for women. But more research is needed to explore these results more deeply. Further, this chapter emphasizes the importance of community-based research. Intersectional analyses can be done on a variety of variables, and local conditions should be carefully considered when trying to select variables. We included marital status based on input from our Palauan co-authors, which then proved to be a very significant result. This highlights how co-development is not only important for research framing and ethics, but methodologically as well. In conclusion, over a series of 5 chapters, this dissertation offers insights to inform the holistic management of marine biodiversity by drawing upon research tools and considerations from across the science, policy, and society dimensions. In part 1, I shared 3 chapters focused at the global level. I contribute theoretically to the field through the development of new methodological approaches. First, I provide a process for collecting and comparing management approaches across jurisdictions. Then, I show how efforts to understand the impacts of climate change should be expanded to also consider the spatial changes as well. I illustrate these methods through a case study approach in the Northeast Pacific, providing empirical data that can be built upon and expanded in future work with updated models. Practically, my research provides insights into governance considerations given the shifting movements of marine animals under climate change, including the importance of expanding biodiversity protections into areas beyond national jurisdiction. In the second part, I focused on how climate change may affect fishing communities in Palau, increasing our understanding of impacts across the society, ecological, and equity dimensions. I combined multiple years of survey data as well as apply novel, high-resolution climate data to this region for the first time. My research also highlights the importance of intersectionality as an analytical framework and provides one of the first detailed assessments into the intersecting role of gender and marital status in the small-scale fisheries context. This research not only provides entry points to inform equitable and sustainable management in Palau, but also serves as a framework that can be easily used in other contexts. Collectively, these studies highlight the importance of interdisciplinary research approaches that engage across various dimensions in order to effectively manage, govern, and sustain our ocean for generations to come. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Well, I have a question
Okay.
on the analysis of shifts in across jurisdiction for migratory species. Would you use a similar analytical approach to determine whether those shifts for some species may result in greater exposure to other threats from fishing, for example, and bycatch?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think you can use a similar approach. I think the challenge lies in having reliable data of the human footprint in order to make those types of comparisons. But I think if you have data that shows human use bounds, I think you can use a similar type of spatial analyses to quantify overlaps, which would be useful.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentation. Really enjoyed it. I was curious more on the policy analysis that you had. Curious about how the theme of international security and national security came up in your research, specifically how these themes of conflict, water contestations, territorial sea disputes, how does that come up in your policy measure analysis?
Yeah, that is a great question. I think that is the type of deeper policy analysis dive that would have been like the next step in this research. I think that chapter was highlighting how we can collect and compare these policies, and I think taking it one step further would have been that next step, looking at really what they mean and how they apply in practice. We didn't take it that step in my chapter, but I'd be excited to see future papers do that.
Well, there's a few questions online, so hello to everyone who's following us online. So the first question is, I'm going to read it. No? Outstanding presentation, thank you. Did you research surface challenges linked to value chains that small-scale fishing communities experienced? In addition, did fishing communities see opportunities to build future resilience linked to value chain improvements on your second part? No?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think part of the second part was tied into a bigger project here at Stanford and Palau on this Abelobi project, looking at how we can connect fishers directly to buyers as a way to potentially help the fishery. So I think that is a potential avenue, connecting the fishers who do want to sell their resources and enabling those avenues related to the value chain.
Great. And then a second question. Absolutely fantastic presentation, Bianca. It has been such an absolute delight, an honor and pleasure to work with you. This is from Colette. Well, as Gabrielle and Larry highlighted, you're a dream student. My question would be, what do you see as the most immediate actionable step informed by your research?
That's a great question. Oh, there's so much I want to say. I want to say more research. I want to say more political will to manage and get on top of passing, sustainable and management legislation. I also think working with fishing communities, I think they hold a lot of the answers and a lot of guidance there. So I think being intentional in those interactions and platforming the people who have been dealing with these changes for a long time. That's how I would answer that. Thank you, Colette.
Thank you. And then a last question. Thank you so much, Bianca. You're incredible. I'm wondering if you could speak on how qualitative data may help build upon intersectionality studies.
Qualitative or
qualitative?
Qualitative data? Yeah. So I think a lot of the intersectionality studies is about how people's experiences are. So I think qualitative data collection is key there. I think it's more easily measured qualitatively, I would say, than quantitatively. And I think it would be also interesting to take it beyond just kind of quantitative surveys and do interviews with fishers to get a more detailed understanding of their individual nuances and experiences.
Okay. Thank you for these great questions online. And then we return here to the home.
Hi, Bianca. Great job. I want to build on the second question that you got on Zoom. And I'm just curious, as one person who doesn't work in this space, but, I care about everything you said. The way you presented it in your research is just so impressive. What can one person do? What would you say is the one thing that as individuals we can do to contribute to this?
This might be cliche, but I would say listen. I think a lot of this is tied to policies and also working with local people. I think listening to others and appreciating what other people have to share and other types of knowledge that we might not always appreciate or fully recognize in the academic space. I think that is a really important part of kind of building a future that works for everybody together.
I'd love to hear you talk more about how you think about bridging global and local governance in this context, especially given what you're saying of a desire to uplift more local experiences, but also the challenge that a lot of international focus is on these areas beyond national jurisdiction that might be more separated from that local experience in the small scale fishers context. So I guess, what do you think about as the horizons in this space from that perspective, and what are you most excited about focusing on as you go forward?
Yeah, I think there's levels of governance. I think there's a fair amount in the governance scholarship about how you need to take local, regional, and global considerations, and that's a whole challenging activity in its own of how do you nest those. It's not, I don't want to say it's funny, but I came into Stanford really, the international was my jam. And I think the opportunity to work with local fishers with some of the Palau stuff in chapter 4, again, just really highlights that one size does not fit all. And it's really going to take listening to communities and co-developing these solutions to even inform all the way up at the global level. So that's just really resonated from my work, and something I've been really grateful to have had the opportunity to learn during my time here.
Thank you. I want to build on Sarah's question. I really appreciate the multi-scalar approach. And also, I just love, Bianca, how you are always thinking about this intersection of equity and sustainability, right? And the conservation issues really bumping up against, issues of access for different kinds of folks. And I wanted to ask, I just wanted to ask from your experience, either at that global level or at the local level or both, about, where do you see the biggest challenges of really balancing the equity issues alongside the conservation priorities? Where have you seen that really, bubble up in your research? And I'm thinking about at the global level, you were writing in your dissertation, there's 6 countries that access the majority of fish in the high seas, right? And we're thinking about what interventions are you taking for conservation and equity in that context? Or in the local context, you're thinking about local communities, and with climate change, people are getting pushed out of the reef areas that are more accessible, where you don't need the same level of gear. And people are having different kinds of access to, boats and equipment, right? So you're getting these conservation policies and equity issues really bumping up against each other. So I don't know, what insights do you have to share around what's most salient in the question space and what kinds of interventions you like to think about?
That's a deep question. I think, what comes to mind particularly is I think equity is super important, and I think it's becoming increasingly recognized as something that's important. And I think it's moving beyond just a checkbox approach to people thinking oh, we're considering this, check it off the box type of thing, to meaningfully operationalizing it. I think about the BB&J Treaty and this opportunity to finally, implement a new framework and how you can operationalize these principles and really include them in a meaningful way. And part of that is some of the things I touched on earlier is, including these types of people in these management decisions. Areas beyond national jurisdictions may seem so far away for local fishers, but those impacts affect them too. And so kind of thinking about the user system more holistically.
Great, thank you. We're going to hold more questions that are coming in for later. I'm going to turn it over back to you, Bianca, for acknowledgements. Thanks.
Great. So thank you guys. So I'm gonna try not to cry, but it's been an emotional morning for me. Yes. So first, I would love to thank my PhD committee and my chair. Thank you so much for your support throughout these past 5 years. And there's so much I want to say that I don't want to say in this forum, but I'm just so appreciative of your collective wisdom and guidance throughout the past 5 years. And it's been so lovely to get to learn and work with you guys. And I think something that's stuck with me is the opportunity to work with people who care about you professionally and personally. And you don't get that in many spaces. And so I'm just very appreciative of that. I gotta thank all my collaborators. It was so hard to get them all on one screen. I'm so lucky to have gotten the chance to learn from so many people across so many institutions. And I do need to give a very, very big thank you and shout out to my Palauan co-authors, fishers, community members who share their time and expertise and their country with me. And chapters 4 and 5 really would not have been possible without them. And I just hope this research is usable for them and something that they can do in the ways that they need to use it. I have to acknowledge funding sources because I got to go to a lot of really cool places when I was at Stanford. So thank you for everybody at Stanford and beyond Stanford for not only research funding, but also travel and conference funding to share my work around the world. I need to shout out a few special people who've mentored me both professionally and personally. I need to give a big thank you to Colette, who I'm sure is online. Just so grateful. Oh, sorry guys. Sybil, Emily, and the whole EJ working group. It's been a great community for me. Dana, Sana, and Caroline, just thank you all for all you've done during my time here. My lab groups. Thank you for shaping my research ideas and just being a really supportive space throughout my time at Stanford. E-IPER staff, we all say this, but E-IPER really is a very, very special program. And it would not be without these people who really provide dedicated student support services to have made my whole experience what it was. And as Larry mentioned, any other place I would not have gone. It was E-IPER or bust when I applied to a PhD program. So thank you for accepting me. The whole E-IPER community has really evolved throughout my both pre and post-COVID time here at Stanford, but it's been a really great group of people to learn from, and I'm just constantly inspired by all the work that people do. Everyone always claims this, but my cohort is the best cohort. So thank you to Will, Cesar, Kiran, Megan, and Erica for just shaping my whole experience here and helping me to survive through 2 years of COVID being indoors. I really appreciate it. I want to thank all my other friends and community within and beyond Stanford, and I'm sure I've missed people, but for your laughter, support, and adventuring and making these whole 5 years what it was. I want to thank my family, especially my mom and my sister who traveled here from the East Coast. It's also my little sister's birthday today. So if you see her, please wish her a happy birthday. And for those of you who don't know, my family immigrated here from Portugal. And I'm a first-generation college student, and I'm also the first in my entire extended family who will be getting a PhD. So it's been a really proud accomplishment. I never thought I would be earning a PhD at a place like Stanford. So I'm very grateful. I also want to acknowledge my family that's still abroad in Portugal, as well as all the generations of sacrifices and hard work that I think has really enabled this achievement for me. And finally, I can't look at him, I'm going to cry. My boyfriend, Joseph, for those who don't know, we met 3 years ago here at Stanford. He was my neighbor. So I like to say he's one of the best things Stanford housing gave me. And it actually was his birthday earlier this week on Monday. So a lot of things to celebrate. And then thanks the countless people I know that I missed, as well as everyone here and online for all your support. Really could have not have done it without you, and I appreciate everybody. So thank you.